On a Tuesday afternoon in November, at 4:47 p.m., Marcus Sullivan was mopping the executive floor of Blackstone Capital on the 42nd level of the Meridian Plaza in downtown Seattle. He was 48 years old, he had a daughter named Isabella who was 12. And he was about to discover that the thing he had sacrificed everything for was about to be used against him. Marcus was a custodian. He had been a custodian for the past 8 years. Before that, he had been many other things, but he did not advertise this. He came in at 3 p.m. each afternoon, cleaned the executive offices, emptied the trash, replaced the paper towels in the bathrooms, and left at 7 p.m. He was invisible in the way that custodians are invisible, present in the space, but not seen, is spoken about in terms of convenience or complaint but not spoken to directly. A fixture of the office like the furniture or the walls. What nobody at Blackstone Capital knew was that Marcus Sullivan had built Blackstone Capital, not alone, not single-handedly. But 15 years ago, when he was 33 years old and newly divorced, he had partnered with a man named Richard Chen and had founded the investment firm that was now worth $380 million. He had been the managing partner. He had made the decisions. He had built the company from nothing into one of the most successful mid-market investment firms in the Pacific Northwest. Then 8 years ago he had left. On this Tuesday afternoon, as Marcus was finishing his mopping on the 42nd floor, a man named David Thornton appeared from one of the corner offices. David was 46, he was wearing an expensive suit. He had the kind of face that had never experienced doubt or concern. He was the current CEO of Blackstone Capital. He had been promoted to this position 3 years earlier, when Richard Chen, the co-founder Marcus had left with, had decided to take a step back and become chairman. David said, "Marcus, I need you to come with me to the conference room." Marcus said, "I still have the rest of the floor to clean." David said, "It's important, it will only take a few minutes." Marcus set down his mop. He followed David to the executive conference room. Inside the room were 8 people. He recognized 2 of them, Richard Chen, his former business partner, and Patricia Williams, the CFO of the company. The other 6 were faces he did not recognize, lawyers, investment bankers, people with the kind of expressions that suggested they were accustomed to controlling situations. Richard stood up when Marcus entered. He looked uncomfortable, the kind of uncomfortable that people look when they are about to ask someone for something they have no right to ask for. Richard said, "Marcus, thank you for coming. We have a situation, and we need your help." Marcus said, "I'm about to clock out. Can this wait until tomorrow?" David Thornton said, "No, it cannot wait. We're in the middle of a merger negotiation. It's worth $420 million. The deal closes in 72 hours. But there's a complication." One of the men Marcus did not recognize, a lawyer from the look of him, pulled out a document. He said, "When you left the company 8 years ago, you signed a separation agreement. In that agreement, you retained certain rights. Specifically, you retained ownership of the intellectual property related to the Chen-Sullivan investment framework, which is the proprietary system that Blackstone Capital has used to generate 90% of its returns. The acquiring company has done their due diligence. They've discovered your stake. They're insisting that you sign a release before they'll proceed with the acquisition." Marcus said, "I'm not signing a release." David Thornton said, "You don't understand, this deal is crucial for the company. We have 400 employees. We have clients who've invested $3 billion with us. If this merger falls through, the firm could collapse. We need you to sign the release." Marcus said, "Then you should have negotiated this before the deal was set to close." Patricia Williams said, "Marcus, please. This is business. We understand you have grievances about how things ended, but this is bigger than that." Marcus said, "No, I don't have grievances, I have clarity, and my answer is no. Now if you'll excuse me, I need to finish my shift." He turned to leave. He moved toward the door, and David Thornton stepped in front of him and closed it. David said very quietly, "You're not leaving until you sign." And Marcus understood in that moment that he had been waiting for this. He had been waiting for 8 years for this moment, not consciously, but the part of him that had built an empire from nothing, that had sacrificed everything for his daughter, that had walked away from all of it because she had needed him more than he needed success, that part of him had been waiting to be asked. Waiting to see if they would finally understand what they had done, waiting to see if they would finally recognize his value. He sat down at the conference table, and he said, "Here's what's going to happen." Marcus Sullivan had grown up in Portland, Oregon. His father had been a postal worker. His mother had been a nurse. Neither of them had gone to college. They had emphasized to Marcus that hard work and education were the path to something more. He had listened. He had worked through high school. He had gotten a full scholarship to the University of Washington. He had graduated summa cum laude with a degree in finance. He had worked at Bank of America for 5 years. And by the time he was 32 he had made enough money to save $100,000, which was significant but which was not enough to be truly comfortable. It was enough to be on the edge of something but not enough to have made it. Then he had met Richard Chen at a conference. Richard had been starting an investment firm. Richard had a vision of a particular kind of market analysis, a system for identifying undervalued assets in mid-market companies. Richard knew what the system could do, but he did not know how to build it. Marcus knew how to build systems. Marcus understood mathematics and programming and database architecture. They had decided to be partners. They had founded Blackstone Capital with the $100,000 that Marcus had saved, plus another $100,000 that Richard had borrowed from his family. They had worked for 4 years without taking a salary, both of them had been living on savings and occasional consulting work, both of them had been married, both of them had been trying to balance the demands of building something from nothing with the demands of being present in their marriages. Marcus had met his wife Sarah when they were both 25. She had been an interior designer. She had been beautiful and creative and had believed in him in a way that had made him feel capable of anything. They had married at 27. Isabella had been born when Marcus was 31. By the time Isabella was 2 years old, the marriage had begun to crack. Not because Marcus and Sarah did not love each other, but because Marcus was working 90 hours a week, and Sarah was working full-time as an interior designer and was also the primary parent to Isabella. The math did not work. Someone had to give, and what had become clear was that Marcus could not give. Marcus was building something. He was building Blackstone Capital, and the building of Blackstone Capital required everything he had. When Isabella was 3, Sarah had said to him, "You have to choose between this company and me, you can't have both." Marcus had understood that she was right. The choice was clear. He had chosen the company. The divorce had been amicable. Sarah had been fair. She had not tried to take everything, but she had taken custody of Isabella. Marcus had visitation rights. He had been paying child support, and he had continued to build Blackstone Capital. From the ages of 3 to 8, Isabella had spent weekends with her father. He would pick her up on Friday night, they would spend Saturday together, and he would return her to her mother on Sunday afternoon. It was the routine that working fathers often kept. It was not ideal. It was not a life where he was fully present, but it was the structure that his choices had created. Blackstone Capital had taken off during those years. By the time Isabella was 8, the company was generating $50 million a year in revenue. By the time she was 9, it was generating $80 million. The proprietary system that Marcus and Richard had created was working. The analysis was accurate. The investments were returning extraordinary results. Marcus had become wealthy, he had become successful. He had achieved the thing that he had been working toward since he was a teenager, and he had done it by being absent, by choosing the company over his family, by telling himself that he was doing it for his daughter, when the truth was that he was doing it for himself. One Friday night, when Isabella was 8.5 years old, he had picked her up from her mother's house for the weekend. She had asked him, in the car on the way to his apartment, if he was going to work while she was there. He had said, "Probably a little bit. There are some things I need to attend to." She had not said anything, but he had looked over at her and he had seen her expression. She had looked like she was accepting something inevitable, like she had stopped expecting him to be fully present and had learned to work around it, and something had broken in him in that moment. He had pulled the car over. He had sat there for a moment without speaking, then he had said, "I'm going to make a change." It had taken him 2 weeks to figure out what the change would be. He had gone to Richard and had said, "I'm stepping back from the company." Richard had said, "What? Why?" Marcus had said, "Because I built a company, and in doing so I lost my daughter, and I can't get those years back. But I can change the direction from this point forward." Richard had said, "You can't just leave. You're the managing partner. You're the technical architect of the entire system." Marcus had said, "Then hire someone to replace me. Or we can find another solution, but I'm done. I'm done with the 90-hour weeks. I'm done with missing her life." Richard had argued. He had pointed out all the things that would break if Marcus left. He had offered to make him chairman instead of managing partner so his hours would be lighter. But Marcus had been firm. He was leaving. That was decided. What had happened was a negotiation. Richard had needed Marcus to stay long enough to transition someone else into his role. They had agreed on a timeline. Marcus would step back over the course of 6 months. He would train a new technical director. He would document the systems, and then he would be completely out. At the end of the 6 months, Marcus had signed a separation agreement. It was a generous agreement. It recognized that Marcus had contributed significantly to building the company. It gave him a one-time payout. It gave him vesting benefits. And it allowed him to retain ownership of certain intellectual property, specifically the core Chen-Sullivan investment framework that was the foundation of all of Blackstone Capital's returns. Why had Richard agreed to this? Because Richard understood that Marcus had earned it. And because Richard had not wanted to fight his former partner. After the separation, Marcus had taken a year off. He had spent that year with Isabella. They had traveled, they had just been together. He had watched her in school, he had helped her with her homework, he had been present, and then he had gotten a job as a custodian at Blackstone Capital. Why had he done this? The answer was complicated. On one level he could get health insurance for Isabella. On another level he wanted to stay in the city where she lived and where her mother lived. On yet another level he wanted to stay connected to the company he had built, but from a different vantage point. But the deepest reason was this: he wanted to understand what he had sacrificed everything for. He wanted to see from the perspective of an outsider, whether the company was actually as important as he had thought it was. Whether the success was real or whether it was just a story he had been telling himself. For 8 years he had mopped floors in the offices where he had once made the major decisions. He had watched the company continue to succeed. He had watched Richard remain the chairman and oversee the business from a distance. When his aunt. He had watched David Thornton come in as CEO and implement new strategies. He had listened to conversations as he cleaned. When his aunt. He had seen the business mature and shift and change, and he had been content, because his daughter was now healthy. His daughter was now thriving. His daughter now had a father who was present. They spent 4 days a week together. They did homework together. They cooked dinner together. They had a life together. He had made the right choice. He had known this for 8 years, but he had not understood, until this moment, what his leverage was. Marcus remained at the conference table. The 8 people around the table looked at him and waited for him to speak. Marcus said, "First I want to know the terms of the merger. Who is acquiring Blackstone Capital, and what is the deal structure?" The lawyer said, "Hartwell Investment Partners is acquiring Blackstone Capital for $420 million. The deal structure is that existing partners will retain 20% equity in the merged entity, and Hartwell will own 80%. The deal is predicated on the assumption that the Chen-Sullivan investment framework remains proprietary to the entity, but our due diligence revealed that you retain certain intellectual property rights that were not disclosed to Hartwell. They're insisting that you sign a release, or they're walking away from the deal." Marcus said, "How much are you paying for those intellectual property rights?" The lawyer said, "We're not paying anything. You're signing a release, which means you're foregoing your rights voluntarily." Marcus said, "That's not going to happen." Richard said, "Marcus, be reasonable. You left the company years ago. You have no claim to the ongoing operation." Marcus said, "I have a contractual claim. I signed a separation agreement that explicitly retained my rights to the intellectual property. That was a negotiated term. That was something we both agreed to." Patricia said, "But you're not using those rights. You're working as a custodian. You're not building a competing company or licensing the framework to anyone else." Marcus said, "That's correct, but I still own them, and Hartwell is correct to require a release before proceeding. They need to own the IP outright. The issue is not whether I should sign, the issue is what I'm being paid for signing." David Thornton said, "You're being paid to keep your job. You're being paid to stay employed. If this deal falls through, this company might not survive. You'll be unemployed." Marcus said, "No, that's not how this works. I'm not being threatened into signing something I don't want to sign. If you want the release, you're going to compensate me for it. That's how business works." Richard looked at Marcus across the table, and something passed between them, a recognition, a memory of the days when they had both understood how business worked, when they had both understood the principle that intellectual property was valuable, and that releasing it required payment. When them and say. Richard said, "How much do you want?" Marcus said, "I want $5 million. The room went silent. David Thornton said, "Absolutely not. That's not reasonable. That's extortion." Marcus said, "It's not extortion, it's negotiation. The framework has generated billions of dollars in returns for this company over 8 years. $5 million is less than 1% of the value it's created. It's extremely reasonable." The lawyer said, "Hartwell won't accept it. They're already pushing us hard on valuation. They'll walk away if we ask for additional payments." Marcus said, "Then explain to Hartwell that they don't own the IP unless they pay for it. Those are the terms. $5 million for the release. If they don't want to pay it, they can walk away. But the company can't proceed without the release, because the IP dispute will haunt the merged entity forever. So it's actually in Hartwell's interest to pay the $5 million, because it eliminates the legal risk." Richard said, "Marcus, there's something else you should know. The deal isn't just about the company, it's about me. I've negotiated a retirement clause that's contingent on the deal closing. If this deal falls through, I lose the retirement clause. I lose the payout that would allow me to actually retire." Marcus looked at Richard, and he felt, for a moment, something that felt like sympathy, but he also felt something else. He felt the weight of 8 years of choice. He felt the clarity of knowing that Richard had chosen the company, and that company was now his to manage. Marcus said, "That's not my problem, Richard. That was your choice to make. I made my choice 8 years ago. This is the consequence of my choice, and I'm willing to accept the consequences of your choice." Patricia said, "What if we offered you $3 million instead of 5? Marcus said, "What if you contact Hartwell and tell them that the release is contingent on a $5 million payment, and let them decide if they want to proceed? My position is not negotiable." David Thornton said, "You're not leaving this room until you sign an agreement." Marcus said, "I understand. Then I'm not leaving this room. I can sit here all night. I have nowhere to be. My daughter is at her mother's house. I don't have other obligations, but I want to be clear. I'm not signing anything for less than $5 million. So you can either authorize that payment, or we can sit here until you decide to let me go." What happened next was a negotiation that lasted for the next 4 hours. Marcus remained seated at the conference table. The other 7 people rotated in and out of the room, taking phone calls, consulting with lawyers, trying to reach someone at Hartwell who could authorize the additional $5 million payment. At 9:15 p.m. David Thornton and Patricia Williams left the room together. When they came back, David looked defeated. David said, "Hartwell has authorized up to $5 million for the IP release, but they want something in exchange. They want you to sign a non-compete clause. They want to make sure that you're not going to take your knowledge of their systems and go into competition with them." Marcus said, "What does the non-compete look like?" The lawyer said, "It's fairly standard. 5-year non-compete. You can't work in the investment management industry. You can't start a competing firm. You can't consult for companies in the sector, but you can work in any other industry." Marcus said, "I accept those terms, but with one modification." David said, "What modification?" Marcus said, "I want the $5 million to be paid into a trust account for my daughter, in her name, so that she owns it outright." The trust begins paying out when she turns 18. Richard said, why do you need that? Marcus said, because this is the first negotiation we've had in 8 years, and I want to be very clear about what I'm building. I'm not building wealth for myself, I'm building security for my daughter. That's what I've been doing for 8 years. That's what I'll continue to do. Patricia said, that's fine, we can structure it that way. Is there anything else? Marcus said, yes, there's one more thing. I want a letter, from Richard and from David, explaining why I left Blackstone Capital. Explaining that I left because I chose to be present for my daughter. I want that letter to be part of the permanent record of the company, because I want it to be clear that there are choices other than the choice to sacrifice everything for success. David said that's not going to happen. Marcus said then we're done negotiating. You can tell Hartwell that the deal is off because I won't sign the release. Richard stood up. He left the room. For 10 minutes there was silence, then he came back. He sat down at the conference table, and he looked at Marcus. Richard said, I'll write the letter. David said, Richard, we don't need to do this. Richard said, no, we do. Marcus is right, I should acknowledge it. Richard pulled a piece of paper toward him. He found a pen, and he wrote, by hand, a letter explaining the circumstances of Marcus's departure. He wrote about the choice Marcus had made to prioritize his daughter over the success of the company. He wrote about how Marcus had built something extraordinary, and then had walked away from it because he understood that some things were more important than success. When he finished he signed it. He passed it to David. David hesitated, but then he signed it too. Marcus read the letter. It was not perfect, it was not a full accounting of everything he had sacrificed, but it was an acknowledgement, it was a recognition. He said thank you. The lawyer prepared the IP release document. It stated that Marcus Sullivan, in exchange for $5 million to be placed in a trust account for Isabella Sullivan, was releasing all claims to the intellectual property formerly known as the Chen-Sullivan Investment Framework. There were supplementary documents regarding the non-compete clause. There were papers regarding the trust structure. At 1:47 in the morning, Marcus signed the documents. His signature on each page was steady and clear. He was not hesitant. He was not uncertain. He was simply ending something that had ended 8 years ago. He was completing the cycle of his choice. When he finished signing, David Thornton gathered the documents. He said, thank you for understanding the business realities. Marcus said, I understand them perfectly. I always have. That's not why I did this. David said, why did you do it? Marcus said, because I wanted you to understand that I'm still here, that I built this company, that I made a choice to walk away, and that the choice I made was not weakness, it was clarity. It was understanding what matters. He stood up from the table. He walked toward the door. David did not try to stop him this time. Marcus left the office at 1:52 in the morning. He drove home. He picked up Isabella from his ex-wife's house. It was late, but his ex-wife had known to wait. He had called her at 11 p.m. and told her to keep Isabella awake, that he would be coming to get her. They drove home together. Isabella was tired but also curious. She asked him why he had picked her up in the middle of the night. He said, because I wanted you to know that something important happened tonight, something that changes things for us. She said, did you get a new job? He said, no, but I negotiated something tonight that means you don't have to worry about money ever again. It means you can do whatever you want with your life. You can go to whatever college you want. You can study whatever you want. You can be whatever you want to be. She said, just like that? Just because you had a meeting? He said, just like that? Because I understood, a long time ago, that my time is more valuable than money. And tonight I was able to sell some of my time for a very large amount of money. So yes, just like that. 3 days later, the merger closed. Hartwell Investment Partners completed the acquisition of Blackstone Capital for $420 million. The Chen-Sullivan Investment Framework became the proprietary property of the merged entity, with no outstanding claims. The news release went out. The company issued a statement celebrating the successful acquisition. Richard Chen and David Thornton were quoted. Marcus was not mentioned. But attached to the company's internal records, in the permanent file of the acquisition, was the letter that Richard Chen had written. The letter explaining that Marcus Sullivan had built the framework, and had then walked away, and had signed the release not because he had to, but because he understood the business realities, and because he valued something more than success. A week later, Marcus went into work as usual. He mopped the floors, he cleaned the offices, he emptied the trash, but something had shifted. People in the office looked at him differently now. Some of them knew what had happened, some of them had heard the story from colleagues. They understood now that the custodian in their building was not just a custodian, he was someone who had built something and had chosen to step away. Richard saw him in the hallway one afternoon and stopped him. Richard said, I want you to know that the letter I wrote will be part of the institutional memory of this company. Years from now, people who work here will read about the choice you made. I want them to understand that there's more than one way to measure success. Marcus said, thank you. Richard said, I also want you to know that I'm going to spend my retirement thinking about the same choice. I chose differently than you did. I'm not sure if I made the right choice. Marcus said, you made the choice that made sense for you at the time. That's the best anyone can do. 6 months later, Isabella was preparing to start high school. She was excellent in her classes. She was thoughtful and kind. She was the kind of person who thought carefully about the world and her place in it. One evening, Marcus was helping her with her homework. She said to him, Dad, I've been thinking about what you did with Blackstone Capital. He said, what do you mean? She said, you could have kept fighting for more money, you could have involved lawyers, you could have made it much more complicated. He said, I could've, but I didn't need to, I had already won. She said, what did you win? He said, I won you. I won the time that we spend together. I won the ability to be present for your life. That's what the $5 million represents in a way. That's the value I placed on the choice I made. $5 million is an enormous amount of money, but it's less than the value I placed on knowing you, on being your father. She said, do you miss it, working at Blackstone? He said, sometimes, but not the way I thought I would. I miss the intellectual engagement, I miss the problem solving, but I don't miss the absence. I don't miss the part of me that was always working, always thinking about the company, always calculating the next move. She said, what are you going to do with your time now? He said, I'm thinking about going back to school. I'm thinking about becoming a financial advisor. I could help people understand their finances. I could teach people about investing. I could do work that helps people, instead of work that only helps investors get richer. She said, that sounds like you. He said, it does, doesn't it? He looked at his daughter. She was on the edge of becoming a teenager. She was becoming her own person. She was thoughtful and curious and kind, and she had become this way because he had chosen to be present, because he had walked away from the thing that most people would never walk away from. Some people might have seen his choice as a failure. Some people might have seen it as weakness, but he knew what it was. It was the recognition that success came in many forms, and that the most important success was not in the companies you built but in the people you raised.